Good morning and welcome. It is so lovely to see so many familiar faces in the room today and to be back in person to the scale that we are. I have had the pleasure of working with Gary on this conference for all 10 years, and I think it's fair to say that this is my favourite conference of the year, and I know that for so many of us, we look forward to it. So Gary, thank you for your leadership, and Dean Leeds, what a wonderful way to start the morning off. Thank you. So, we are going to talk about trust and technology this morning. It's probably not the topic that you think first of when you think of governing of emerging technologies. But even today, with the Supreme Court coming out about 2 decisions associated with Google and Twitter, we are reminded just of how important trust is when it comes to technology. And I think Gary's decision to put this session first shows that this is how we should frame the next 2 days. Trust is central and pivotal to the adoption of new technologies in our society. And I am honoured and privileged to actually get to moderate this panel with 4 amazing individuals who have been at the forefront of thinking about trust in technology. Today, our session is going to start. I'll do a brief introduction. If we would go through their CVs and all that they have achieved, it would take up all 90 minutes. So it'll be short and sharp. Each of our speakers will then come to the podium and speak for about 5 minutes. We will then have a moderated Q&A, and then we'll have an opportunity to open up the session to you, for you to be able to ask our 4 experts some questions. So with no further ado, let me introduce our 4 phenomenal speakers. First, I'll begin with Hilary Sutcliffe, who was the brains behind this panel. I've had the pleasure of working with Hilary for 16, nearly 17 years, which feels, I think I just dated myself in that respect. Hilary currently runs London-based not-for-profit SocietyInside, through which she explores trustworthy and trust in the governance of technologies, which is supported by the World Economic Forum. Among many other things, Hilary sits on the advisory board of the Carnegie Council of Ethics and AI, an advisor to the International Congress for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence, and one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in 2019 and 2021. Hilary, welcome. And thank you for coming from across the pond to do so. Michelle is the Deputy Director of Panelists and Insight with the Science team at the Food Standards Agency, the regulator for food in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. With more than 20 years in government and a background in communication, she remains an endlessly curious scholar of public attitudes and behaviours. She leads a multidisciplinary team of analysts and has access to leading experts and a wide range of research tools to understand how and why people do what they do and what the future looks like when it comes to food. Again, welcome and thank you for coming across the pond. And I love this one. Helen Autonomous Futures Gould, founder of Tech Strategizers, is an internationally recognised futurist, consultant, speaker, and author. She looks at trustworthy technology and developing IEE standards for organisational governance of AI. Helen is best known for starting and leading Intel's efforts in automated driving, which resulted in a more than $15 billion acquisition of Mobileye, which is now worth more than $2 billion a year. Helen's passion is for making the world a better place and making our autonomous future more cool and less creepy. Our 4th panelist today is Mary Engel, who is Executive Vice President Policy at BBB National Programs, where she oversees and develops advertising, privacy, and other self-regulatory and dispute resolution programs. Mary joined BBB National Programs in 2020 after a 30-year career with the Federal Trade Commission, where she played a leading role in developing the FTC's policies on, among many things, green marketing, influencer marketing, child-directed marketing, and video game marketing. Mary was awarded the Presidential Meritorious Executive Rank Award in 2012. I would now like to invite Hilary to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good morning, and such an honour to be here and your 10th anniversary as well. So my research on trust in governance began with the observation that we talk a lot about trust in technology, but we don't really talk about how the regulation in its own right needs to consider and take seriously the earning of trust of the public, but also of its other stakeholders. And I spent since 2017 looking at this and researching this. And it's quite interesting. Trust is really good to have. So whether you're an academic institution, an individual, a regulator, a government, if you're trusted, you are let to get on with things. Things are smoother for you. People want to work with you. They want to collaborate with you. You get given the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. Trust gives you freedom to act. Being distrusted does the opposite. Being distrusted, people don't listen to you in the same way. Just think about when you don't trust someone. Whatever they say, you actually are skeptical. You don't really want to work with them. You don't really trust what they're doing. So you put blocks and you put sort of things in the way. If you're distrusted, you don't have the freedom to operate. And you actually have more costs, more time, more effort involved. And whatever organisation or individual you are, if you are distrusted, life is much more difficult. And I had the observation, actually, that regulation is based on that distrust. Regulation says we know companies won't act in the public interest. We know they'll really act in their own self-interest. So we're just going to have to make them. And I just thought, what if organisations were trustworthy and could be trusted? How would regulation look then? But trust in regulators is important. I'm looking particularly at public trust. And I've been talking about this importance of regulators earning trust for a while, and everyone's going, yeah, right. Until COVID. And then suddenly, trust in the approvals process of the vaccine was as important for public confidence as trust in the vaccine itself. And everyone suddenly knew what I was on about, which was nice. And then we found also trust in technology. The Centre for Data Ethics, which is a government body in the UK, did some research. And the biggest predictor of whether people felt the tech in COVID had a role to play was trust in the rules and the regulations surrounding that whole technology. That was more predictive than what they thought about COVID, what they thought about the technology, what they thought even if it was going to work or not. That the fact that the regulation was on the case and was good regulation in the public interest was the single thing that made them believe that that technology was valuable. Similarly, too, in terms of a lot of technologies, I sort of started this, because I'm 112, I started doing technologies, really, we started this in 1996, where it wasn't really technology, it was sort of governance of science and a bit of technology. And across that time, I've been working in nanotech and biotech. I was on the quantum tech public dialogue oversight group, and AI and robotics. And I did an analysis of the public dialogues in the UK and Europe, about 20 different public dialogues on all sorts of different technologies. And contrary to our beliefs that the public's very sort of risk averse, publics are quite supportive of technologies. They're quite intrigued and interested to see what will happen. But they felt that when it goes wrong, and that was the thing, they were quite sanguine, you're going to cock it up. When it goes wrong, how are the regulations going to deal with this? Have you thought about it in advance? And what is the governance like to make this safe for me? And the regulation loomed really large in their minds, and I hadn't appreciated until I did that work that would happen. And so I think when this work that I was doing in trust, in fact, I remember I looked at trust in psychology and political science and social science, and it was really, really confusing. I actually do remember laying my head on my desk and crying at one point because no one actually, it was so confusing. No one agreed with each other. It was all, and then I realized, in fact, that the head of a regulator in the UK told me, no, forget the trust stuff. The academics don't agree with each other. They're all fighting for their own little corner. Trust is this, trust is that. So I just was so relieved. It's not me. It's actually that it's really complicated. No one really agrees with each other. But what happened when I got over that, was I realized there were things that were common across all these different, disciplines of trust, which were actually the drivers of trust, or what I'm now calling the signals of trustworthiness. And these are an intent, a public interest intent, not a particularly self-serving intent. Competence, you can have the greatest intent, but if you're useless, then you can't be trusted. Honesty, a big driver of trust is honesty and integrity. Fairness and openness, inclusion and respect. And when I distilled these, I was really disappointed because I wanted some really new sexy trust things so that I could talk about. But actually, these values are so sort of commonplace, even in all sorts of different cultures, these trust values. When you see people that you don't trust, and I'm in the UK at the moment, we have a government, and those trust drivers are absent when you see people you don't consider trustworthy. When you trust people, they are absolutely clear to see. So part of the point of when you asked me to do this, what's important, what actually makes trustworthiness, these values are the things that make trustworthiness. And these are the things that actually I've now spent the last few years looking at how they then manifest themselves with tech and with governance. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you for framing the morning's discussion so perfectly. I saw many people smiling and nodding away as you were talking about both the academics, but also what happens when you do not trust. And that is a perfect segue to Michelle, coming from a regulatory agency. Please.
So good morning. Thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you, Diana, and thank you to ASU for having me here. Who am I to talk to you about trust? Well, I've worked in regulators for most of my career. I've headed up comms teams. I've transferred into science teams. And now I work in the UK's most trusted regulator, which is the Food Standards Agency. We do food. And we are well nigh obsessed with trust. And I'm quite obsessed with it because it's my area of great interest. I spent ages being on the kind of the really sharp end of what happens when things go wrong and when you're trying to argue your point and when you're trying to say something is safe and you're being, phoned up at 2 a.m. by the Daily Mail because something's fallen on the floor. And I wanted to kind of start today, and I'm really glad that this is the first session. It's great framing for all of the other really fascinating sessions, with some of the things I've learned about doing it in real life. Because we were set up in the wake of a breach of trust, right? The BSE crisis, you must have all heard about that. Science said it was fine. Politicians didn't want to own up to it. People died. And so in the result of that, they set up an independent, non-ministerial, funded science and evidence department who could call it out when there was something wrong with the food. And the reason that's so important for food, and hopefully you'll be able to make the link to all the other new things, is that, as Slovich tells us, risk is a feeling, right? It is an emotional transaction that people make thousands of times a day to trust a thing, to trust what they're putting in their mouth, to trust the car they're getting into without a driver. And they trust us, they make that deal with us, and we tell them that the food is safe again. And so we look at this a lot, and we're the most trusted regulator, I think, because we really do track this. I mean, I track this monthly, 6 monthly, and those figures are really, really high. I won't read them all out. You can see them. It's an amazingly big screen. But what's really interesting is also we're really trusted by the businesses that we regulate. There are about 500,000 small and medium food businesses in the UK, about 10 really, really big ones. And in the latest wave of our small and micro business tracker, we found that 95% of the businesses that we spoke to, and we didn't, go in like the regulator, we sent in independent researchers, said that they thought we were influential in maintaining the standards of food. 93% said that we worked really hard to do that. 90% said that we were good at identifying where there were poor standards, and 87% said that we were good at understanding the needs of business, which actually, from a regulator's point of view, is incredibly high. Now, I wanted to show you this, because this was a piece of work that I looked at in about 2018. It was about the relationship of trustworthiness, in food, the food regulator, the food system. And we did this through a piece of deliberative work. And what was interesting is, on top of understanding loads about that, which I'll come to in a minute, we learnt about how you can get a person from a state of what I like to call blind faith through to a state of informed trust. And this happens so often in the deliberative work that we do, and we do deliberative work because it's a complex system, and we ask people to really think about how this Kit Kat got onto their table, and they freak out. And they freak out in the same way every time. And this is the journey they go on. And I think this is a really interesting one because it's a big ask to get a regulator, a company, an innovator, to take the people they're asking to trust them on that journey from blind faith, everything's fine, through to I understand this a bit and I'm willing to make that transaction with you. But it is worth it, because that situation at the end is far more resilient than the fragile blind faith is when people are not, fully aware of what's going on. So I just wanted to share with you this journey. So Caitlin Connors, who's one of the researchers I work with a lot, she calls this the deliberative dip. And we experience this when we're trying to introduce a new technology, gene editing, synthetic biology, to the public and see where they're going with it. I'll echo what Hilary said about what builds trust. And I'm going to say it's trustworthiness. It's social trust. Do I believe that you're acting in line with my values, not just your profit? And it's cognitive trust. Do I believe that you're competent enough to deliver on the promises you've made? And I'm going to argue that actually when you're doing it in real life, there's a third factor, which is visibility. So people have to see this. You have to be proactive about this. You have to demonstrate this and earn this. There is no way of faking it. That people have asked me for years, what's the quick way to build trust? Well, there isn't a quick way. Just be trustworthy every time. Make the right call every time. And that's actually really hard, because there's a pace mismatch between the innovation that you're being asked to get to the market and the risk perceptions of the public that you're asking to trust you. Because when things go wrong, and they do, honesty is tough, the environment you're operating in is hostile, and the people that you're asking to go and explain this to people, to get people through this deliberative dip and earn their trust, aren't really trained for it. So when the rubber hits the road, as it were, lots of scientists get a bit afraid. They won't stand up, they won't go on Twitter, they won't explain, and some of them can't explain in terms that are clear enough for anyone to really trust. And then sometimes you can't offer what everybody wants. Public opinion and the public interest are not always the same thing. And as a regulator, you have to weigh up really carefully what the public interest is. What is the decision that you need to make that is in the best interests of everyone? And how do we demonstrate that the decision we've made is in the best interests of everyone? And I'll give you an example. The gene editing in the UK, the bill's just gone through. Very, very clear that what the public want is transparent information. They do want labels. We can't give them labels, so we can offer them transparent information, we can offer them confidence, but we can't offer them choice, which is what they said they wanted. Decision was taken out of our hands by ministers that was the way it was going to go. So sometimes it's a very, very complex business, and you've got, people cross with us on all sides about that one. But there we are. And sometimes it's hard because it looks like it's going wrong. Right, those headlines are from 2017. There was pesticide in the eggs. We found out about it. We told everyone about it. I had a real fight with Downing Street to be able to be as upfront about this as we had to be. We felt we had to be, because otherwise, in the long run, we would be eroding our social trust. People expect us to call it out when there's something in the food. In fact, our reputation, our trust scores went up and up and up because of how proactive we were with how we handled this. But when you look at those headlines, you can imagine they were not best pleased on day one. And what does it mean in real life? Well, it means that you've got to focus on demonstrating that social trust as well as being good at it. You've got to demonstrate that you have people's interests at heart. And do that. Don't just tell people, show people. Be open, be transparent with the information. Explain why you're making the decisions. Explain the trade-offs you've had to make. This is hard. Demonstrate your independence, because that's part of the values that people expect from a regulator. You've got to be resilient enough to go out there and tell your story. And that is terrifying. But you can influence the coverage of an incident, for example, but never be empty-chaired. Be aware of who it is that's telling the story. I think going back to what Hilary was saying, if you don't trust the person who's telling you, you'll never believe what they're saying. So think about who is delivering that message. And in order to do that, you have to develop the people from the start. You have to hire people who can do this. And here's the problem. Most scientists aren't trained for this. So having spent my life at the interface between communication and science, and having, been listened to differently, let's put it that way, depending on which department I found myself in, I think either you're going to have to develop those communication skills or you're going to have to start respecting the people that have them. And then really set your mind to it. Now, you can't really fatten a pig by measuring the pig, but certainly you can demonstrate the importance of the pig by having open metrics about it. And that's why we are so keen to measure trust. Because when it is all up in the air, what looks like a PR disaster can actually be the thing that saves you if you respond to it properly. So that's the last thing I would say is, have the measures, think about them, not just in terms of have we heard of the brand, what do we think, but what are the things behind it? What are the things that drive that trust? What perceptions of social and cognitive trustworthiness are you really looking for here? So hopefully those are some good opening thoughts to frame our conversation.
Congratulations on being the most trusted regulator in the UK. That is no small feat, and the fact that it's such a competition clearly between the regulatory agencies says a lot about the political environment and just the landscape that you're operating in, and especially when it's something so intimate. Food is such an intimate experience and thing in our lives, and to be the most trusted says a lot about the work you're doing. So thank you for sharing your story. I would now like to welcome Helen to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and it's my honor and privilege to be here today. So, first I have some explaining to do. So I have a teenage son, and my teenage son said, "Mom, your parents gave you cool AF initials. You should use them." So that's what I'm doing, and also because there's a doppelganger, Helen Gould, who advises the tech industry, who grew up 5 miles from my house, and we went to the same pediatrician. And then there's another Helen Gould, who's a proctologist and a prolific publisher. So I needed a way to kind of differentiate. All right, so a little bit more about me. So thank you, Diana, for the introduction. I was that little girl who loved robots and science fiction. And I grew up in a house filled to the rafters with technology of all kinds, from vintage vacuum tubes all the way to the latest and greatest computer technology. And I chose as a career to focus on humans and autonomous systems, because I knew I didn't want to program robots or build them, but I was fascinated by how humans and autonomous systems could work together. And I am on the optimistic side, I confess. So, as was mentioned, I started Intel's automated driving business over a decade ago. And one of my jobs was to figure out what can possibly go wrong with a computer driving your car. So I led the corporate risk assessments, I made the business case for us to enter the business, and how to do so to be a trustworthy and a competent and a great supplier of this new technology in this new space that's going to revolutionize the way we move from point A to point B. In addition to, well, first, how many people have advanced driver assistance systems on their car? Okay, a good number, maybe some on the balcony too. Over 70% of those are made by Mobileye and Intel. So, a lot of you have Intel inside, whether you knew it or not. And in addition, I had the opportunity during my long career at Intel to work on not automated factories and highly automated factories. And to work with Moore's Law, there was a technology treadmill, and it disrupted people. So factories would close, new factories would open, and there was a constant increase in terms of technology, but also automation. And so part of my job was to help the workforce transition, into this new automated world that they faced. I worked on the digital home. I worked on the autonomous data center. So at what point did data centers start to make their own decisions? It's fascinating. Okay. And then I had the opportunity to co-lead Intel's efforts in the autonomous aerial revolution. Everything from flying taxis and delivery drones to aerial ride sharing and overhauling the world's air traffic control system, because it was designed for humans 70 years ago, for humans on the ground to talk to humans in the air, and it doesn't work at all for unmanned aerial vehicles. So, fascinating challenge to solve. I retired in January 2020, just before the pandemic, and I'm not here speaking on behalf of Intel. So I'm kind of on my own. I'm working with Gary and team on the IEEE standards for organizational governance of AI, and I started my own, consulting firm. And my primary focus is on sharing some of my experience, sharing some of my thoughts and ideas, and COVID was a real wake-up call. We're only here for what period of time, so I'm here to share my ideas. And the book I'm writing, the first one, is Creating Trustworthy Technology, a Practitioner's Toolkit. So the intent is not only how can we make technology, but a little bit of nudging towards how can we do it in a trustworthy manner. Okay, so I want to start by echoing what was said earlier about trust and distrust, and add one in the middle, okay? So trust is about can and should we trust the technology. I think we all intrinsically, understand that. But what's also important is to have a language that we can use. So on the side of distrust, I have intent to deceive, to kind of, just as we have misinformation and disinformation, I think the prefix here is very, very important. And that is, how can technology intentionally be misused or abused on the distrust side? Then what's fascinating is the middle, where we have mistrust, which may be inappropriate, it's hard to see the slides, incorrect or inappropriate use of technology. And here you have overtrust in technology, undertrust in technology, and the potential for unintentional misuse. So intentionality is a very important concept here. And then I wanted to introduce the concept of inferred trust. So one of my favorite examples is how I got here. I boarded an airplane yesterday morning in Portland, Oregon. I decided to leave terra firma and get into a metal cylinder and leave the ground and, magically appear in Arizona 2.5 hours later. So it's incredible that humans adapted and were able to make that leap of faith, that it was not only okay, but a fabulous experience to travel by air. And that's only been in the last 100 years that we have really made that leap of faith, as a civilization. So what's interesting also about it is we're placing, when we do that, inferred trust. I, as a passenger, place my trust that I will safely reach my destination. And yes, I did. And I also placed trust in the airlines, that the pilot was trained, the staff knew what we were doing, the plane was well maintained, in the regulators, that they had done what they needed to do to preserve airworthiness. It was a Boeing. Okay, so what Boeing did to design and build a safe and reliable aircraft, and then their suppliers. So it's fascinating, kind of not only direct trust, but also how we infer trust. And now I'll put the two together. Inferred trust inferred mistrust, and inferred distrust. So this gets fascinating. So Michelle did an outstanding job of explaining how her agency has inferred trust both from the public, and I assume from other regulators, and from the businesses that are being regulated. So that's a super example of inferred trust. Then I was at a conference a few weeks ago, Urbanism Next, fabulous conference, okay, the theme was automated driving and the implications on public policy and urban planning. And I got into a really interesting discussion with one of the colleagues there, and he was talking about, well, I heard that Company X had a fatal crash involving an autonomous vehicle. So in his mind, this technology was not safe, and that he would never ride in an autonomous vehicle, he would never buy one, and it didn't matter which company it was from. So this is an example of undertrust and how what happens in one situation can be inferred to apply to an industry, to other companies, and more broadly. So I thought that was interesting. And then inferred distrust, I had to go there. Okay, so, 2016, there was the big Cambridge Analytica and Facebook scandal. And more than half a century later, not century, decade, okay, there was a survey done by Digital Trust benchmarks by Insider Intelligence, and Facebook was still the least trusted of the 9 major platforms. So once you have broken that trust and you have distrust, it's very hard to repair, and it can take a long, long time. So there's that. And then one of the things that I've also been working on is how to foster greater trust. What mechanisms are we using today that we may not have put a label on, and how can those help to create greater trust? So the first one is advisory trust, and that's typically based on standards or subject matter experts, and it's not legally binding. Okay, that's kind of advise me. So, and then there's protective trust, which just tends to have rules and regs and laws and is typically enforceable. And then explanatory trust, which is through education and building understanding and how things work and why and things of that nature. And then demonstrative trust, which is earned when you have proof, or you have certification, or you have independent verification. And what was fascinating to me as I was joining this panel is I realized that we perfectly map. Okay, so Hilary and SocietyInside maps perfectly with advisory trust, and what Michelle is doing with food safety maps perfectly with protective trust, and what Diana and myself are doing is kind of in the explanatory trust area. And then what we'll hear about next with Mary is all about demonstrative trust. Show me. So this was really interesting that all of us mapped, and it is my hope that the book I'm writing will be, help us in the explanatory trust mechanisms. Okay, and with that, I would like to say thank you and have Mary join us.
Congratulations on the book. I think you might be the one person that we can ask, when are we getting the Jetson cars?
Oh, yes, okay. So it's coming, okay? So, and we're making actually excellent progress, and there's a few companies that have been working on airworthiness certifications, and it's fascinating.
It's coming. I've always wanted to find somebody who would actually answer that question. So, well, that's the next question.
So what we'll do first is we establish trust with ground vehicles, then we infer that trust to aerial vehicles.
Wonderful, thank you. Now I'd like to welcome to the floor Mary. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a delight to be here, although a little bit hard to follow the Jetsons car, I have to say. And I wasn't necessarily a fan of robots per se growing up, but I was a huge Star Trek fan, so I'm still looking for the ability to beam somewhere. That's even more advanced. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit, I think it follows very nicely from the discussions we've just heard, about what businesses can do to increase trust, both on their own and collectively when working together. So first I'd like to give a little bit of background. Let's see, okay, here we are. Background on my organization, BBB National Programs. So in 2019, the Better Business Bureau, we spun off from the Better Business Bureau. You have the Better Business Bureau, BBB, which runs the local BBBs and accredits companies. And then my organization is a separate nonprofit organization that develops and operates over a dozen different industry self-regulatory and accountability programs, primarily in the areas of advertising, privacy, and dispute resolution. So our mission is to create marketplace trust and to serve both businesses and consumers. And so I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about what industry self-regulation is. For our organization, what we saw is different companies facing marketplace problems and coming together to try to solve those problems. And doing that by creating programs that have various different elements, but usually, and in fact, there's sort of a whole kind of pyramid of different types of accountability measures that can be included in a self-regulatory program. But there's usually some sort of agreed upon standards, some sort of monitoring and compliance, some dispute resolution procedures, and maybe an appellate process. It's also important to have a good, close relationship with whatever regulator oversees the industry. For most of our programs, that is the Federal Trade Commission, which, as Diana mentioned, I worked at for 30 years before I joined BBB National Programs. BBB National Programs, so for example, we have 6 different programs in the area of advertising. And they're our oldest programs, actually, founded back in 1971, 2 of them, the National Advertising Division and the National Advertising Review Board. And they were a result of the ad industry wanting to increase trust in advertising in light of, there was a lot of concern about what was going on TV. And so they created this program. We open investigations based on our own monitoring, or competitors file complaints. We render a decision. And that decision can be appealed to the National Advertising Review Board, which is a body made up of advertising industry members. So it's kind of a peer review process rather than being heard by attorneys. We have, even though it's a voluntary process, we have excellent compliance, 90 to 95% compliance. In the case of non-compliance or non-participation, the company gets referred to the appropriate regulator. Usually that is the Federal Trade Commission. We also have programs in the areas of privacy. So for example, our Children's Advertising Review Unit actually issued guidelines on children's online privacy in 1996, really at the dawn of the internet and the World Wide Web, even before Congress passed the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. And now we run a safe harbor program under COPPA. We were the first ones to be approved by the FTC to do that. So being in the business of self-regulation, we got very alarmed when we started hearing regulators say, the time for self-regulation is over. The headlines that are on this screen here came from a Senate hearing on big tech, social media platforms, where there was, senators were concerned and upset about the lack of self-regulation by tech members with respect to social media in particular, and all the harms that were befalling consumers, especially young people. But it's really important in this context to distinguish between a company's own self-policing efforts and independent industry self-regulation done by a third party. And it's obviously very important for industries and companies to self-police, but their self-policing efforts will always be viewed with some suspicion. It'll be looked upon as a little bit of the fox guarding the hen house, that processes aren't sufficiently transparent, there's not enough accountability, and not really meeting all of the trust factors that Hilary set out. I was actually very interested to see the trust factors because they actually align pretty closely with what is needed for trustworthy self-regulation. And so on the screen here are some characteristics of successful industry self-regulation that the FTC has highlighted, and they include clear standards, widespread industry adoption, active monitoring programs, effective enforcement mechanisms, procedures to resolve conflicts, a transparent process, and sufficient independence from industry itself. So the FTC, has put out these types of standards or characteristics, and we work hard at BBB National Programs to make sure that our programs actually meet and follow these types of characteristics so that they do have credibility. So, and as well, the FTC has pointed out to the value of independent industry self-regulation, and there are factors that they have listed are up on the screen, and looking at the ability and the value of self-regulation and what it can bring to a marketplace. We have been thinking about the problems and perils posed by emerging technologies, whether it's social media or AI, especially generative AI and all of the other technologies. And it seems to us that there is a possibility here for industry self-regulation, independent industry self-regulation, to take a stab at trying to resolve some of these problems. A couple of years ago, Gary and his team here at ASU really kind of surveyed the landscape for what was going on with ethical AI principles and found hundreds of different frameworks and standards and codes of conduct and the like. But they found that very few of them actually had third-party independent verification. And I think that is kind of the missing link of what needs to be done here. And even since that collection or survey of the landscape, and especially with the release of ChatGPT and the apparent arms race on generative AI, more and more proposals have come out. There's now legislative proposals as well. And so it really does raise the possibility of whether this is an area that makes sense for self-regulation. The government is looking at this space, but the ability of the government to, and I am a former regulator in law enforcement, so I have much love for the government, but I do also recognize its limitations, and the ability of the government to regulate in this area is questionable. When you look at things like, we've been concerned about online privacy for decades, and Congress has yet to pass a comprehensive privacy bill. As I mentioned, Congress has held a ton of hearings on social media platforms and all the threats of big tech, and they rant and they rave, and they, name and shame, essentially, but in the end, they haven't been able to pass a bill, and I doubt that one will pass that can survive First Amendment scrutiny. And I even just saw the headlines this morning about the Supreme Court's latest ruling, and I haven't had a chance to read or digest at all, but that actually, just supports the idea of that it's very difficult for the government to regulate content moderation and those sorts of decisions in this space without running afoul of the First Amendment. So we have a situation here, I think, where business leaders could show their comparative advantage in this space. They know what restrictions and guardrails would work and what wouldn't work. They can move more quickly and nimbly. They can change to according to what's the changing technology more easily. They have the expertise and experience to bring to bear on solving these problems. And they can even choose to limit their own speech and their own conduct in a way that the government cannot do without running afoul of the First Amendment. So thinking about this, we see an opportunity to create trust with the public for these emerging technologies. Tech leaders could convene to create guidelines, to hold themselves accountable, to agree to monitoring and verification and public reporting. So many people, hopefully some people remember years ago, Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. That was in the context of nuclear arms control. And I remember thinking at the time, well, that doesn't really make sense to me. It seems contradictory. If you trust, you don't need to verify. But when the stakes are high, it does make sense to have verification. And I think to Hilary, I think you mentioned that there's a difference between blind faith and trust, right? So yeah, so the verification will really enhance the trust and could be what's needed here to help address some of these problems. Thanks. Oops. I had another slide that I didn't show, but that's okay.
Thank you. As I was just listening to you, I think with the recent congressional hearings and the Supreme Court rulings this morning, I think there's one thing we can be very clear on is that we actually don't trust government to be able to regulate this well. I think that if we did a quick survey of hands, I think that would be overwhelming in that direction. So thank you for 4 amazing presentations. So many ways to go. And so I think, Hilary, I might start with you, if that's okay, but this is definitely a question that I think everybody I'd love to hear you jump in on, is why is trust important for tech governance?
Well, I think sort of, I would say, I was trying to say in the talk, thinking about when it goes wrong. So I've been doing more work on distrust and the sort of costs of distrust, and I'm very taken with Obama's foreign policy mantra, which is don't do stupid shit. Because when it goes wrong, it's just so obvious. It's so obvious. I mean, you know, we see it coming, you know, people see it coming a mile away. And when, you know, the biggest finding of my trust project actually is to listen and take seriously the people you don't take seriously, because they are the ones who are telling you all along the thing that's going to get you into biggest trouble. So I think in terms of, you know, why trust is important, when it's gone, it is really difficult for everybody. I mean, in fact, trust in regulation, when we look at the implications, particularly with new technologies on society, societal confidence, what that means. There's a great report from the Inter-American Development Bank, which looked at the impact of distrust on the whole of society. And it really unravels society. People don't trust each other, people don't trust politicians, people don't trust regulators, and therefore we all shrink into ourselves, do our own thing, and won't share, and it's for the detriment of society. So I would go as far to say, not necessarily tech in its own right, but the implications, for example, of the problems we're seeing with social media and ChatGPT, where we can't trust anything, has dramatic and will have dramatic implications for social cohesion, but for all sorts of things. So I think we have to take trust seriously because, as the Development Bank showed, actually it means that society can actually unravel from lack of trust.
Okay. Would anybody else like to jump in? And if you press the button on the microphone, the green light should go on to show that the microphone is on.
So I just thought that was a really interesting way of framing it. And I was thinking about the vaccine take-up in the UK when it came to COVID. One of the determinants of vaccine take-up was not trust in science, it was trust in government. And the constituencies that were least likely to take up the vaccine, if you looked at the qualitative work, weren't worried about the competence of the vaccine, they were worried about the intent of the people pushing it. And if you've had your whole life where the intent of the people has not been demonstrating your interests at all, and we saw this with various different ethnic groups, different social groups, why would you trust at that point? Now that's where, you know, we were asking people to take a huge leap on the word of these people, and it was really interesting to see how the demographics broke down and why people weren't taking vaccines. It wasn't trust in science, it was trust in the intent of the people selling it to them.
And also, just to build on that, actually, people don't trust politicians, and so, but they do trust regulators. And actually, it was the trust in the process, and the regulators that were more open and more communicative with what they were doing across the world were actually more trusted. And there's some really interesting stats we don't have to mind about trust and vaccine take-up that associate with regulation and the ability of the regulator to communicate and to their efficiency of their processes.
Great, thank you. So building on that, we're already touching upon different industries, different tech applications. And Mary, I'd love to ask you, do different industries have different trust relationships with the public?
this on? Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and to the experience of it goes to what people have experienced with different industries. Right now, it's very interesting. The Edelman Trust Barometer shows that individuals, consumers, have more trust in businesses right now than they do in government or in the media. And not clear exactly why this is, but it's thought that it has something to do with how companies responded to the pandemic, and we all ended up relying on tech companies in a big way. So even at the same time, there's a lot of concern about, especially in the privacy arena, about what tech companies are doing. People also saw that, when push came to shove, they were able to do some really remarkable things to keep us all working and living and doing whatever else. But it is, I think it's just a function of what the companies and businesses have done over time. And I think Helen pointed out how, long it's taken Facebook to kind of regain the trust after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And one wonders, I don't know if that always happens, though. It's been fascinating to me to see to what extent is it a function of how much consumers really need a certain product or company, and so maybe some get away with more than others.
Fantastic, thank you. So Helen, I'd like to pick up a little bit in terms of your background and bio. And the concept of science fiction obviously played a big role in terms of your childhood and even into adulthood. How do you think science fiction influences trust in technology?
So that's a very interesting question. So thank you. Is Andrew here?
I saw him, yes, he's out the back.
Okay, Andrew. All right, so feel free to jump in, okay, if you want. Okay. So what's fascinating to me is humans have been wrestling with trust since the dawn of human civilization. Okay, back to caveman days and warring tribes and, all through human history. There's been a lot about human trust of other humans. Now, what's fascinating to me that it's largely been the last century where technology has really become such a huge part of our lives that we now have to also grapple with not just trust of other humans, but trust of technology itself. And then coincident with that, roughly a century, we have science fiction. And science fiction has brought both dystopian views of the future as well as utopian views of the future, as well as kind of a really interesting hybrid kind of between the two. So our thoughts and perceptions of technology are shaped by experience, but they're also shaped by the books we've read, the shows we've watched, the media we've consumed, the movies, and many of us have visceral memories of the voice of Hal from 2001, or the Jetsons, as was mentioned earlier, or the Back to the Future hoverboards and flying cars. So this has now become part of our culture, part of our view of the world, and we can look at it in a robophilic type way, where we have a positive view from science fiction, or we can look at it in a robophobic view, where we go to more that dystopian side and we think of Skynet. So it's all just fascinating about how much science fiction has shaped our views of technology, and for the good in terms of what's possible. If we look at it now, the Star Trek replicators and 3D printing, that's interesting. And the use of a cell phone, well, the use of tasers and phasers on stun from Star Trek. So the whole thing has really shaped our views and our thoughts and our perceptions of technology as technology for good, as well as technology for not good.
Thank you. So Michelle, I picked up in your presentation, it was the egg scandal. And you alluded to it very briefly in terms of a interaction that you had with Downing Street, and clearly trust was central to this. Can you walk us through what happened?
Yeah. So, I mean, people know, Downing Street is where the Prime Minister lives. It's the head office of the Cabinet. And most government departments have a minister, and they answer to a minister. We don't, for a really good reason. And the reason is, you know, sometimes you have to say stuff that is politically unpalatable, like there's something in the eggs, and it's been there for 3 weeks, and we don't know how many of them there are. And while we're pretty sure it won't do you any harm unless you eat a really inordinate amount of eggs, and even then, it won't kill you, it shouldn't be there, and we don't quite know yet how it got there. And you can pretend that didn't happen, or you can tell people. And we have one job, it's to tell people, but that isn't really necessarily something that is, you know, in line with the political agenda. And without, you know, going into too much detail, I was under some pressure to not do that. And we had to go all the way up to the head of the civil service, to the independent civil service, and he's passed on now, but to Jeremy Haywood, who was the head of the civil service, who's one of the only people old enough to remember why we were set up in the first place. And, you know, put the case to say they don't get to sign off my press release. They just don't get to. There's an exception made when it comes to food, and because we got it wrong before, we have to kind of do this. We don't do it very often. And he turned around and was like, she's right, leave her alone. And we put it out. Now, what was really interesting about that one is I had all of the leadership of the organisation doing jazz hands around me, going, you know, this is going to be terrible for our reputation. We have, you know, we've gone out there and we've basically committed harikiri in the middle of the media. We had to do 20 interviews back to back. We had an amazing director of science who could put the issues out there honestly, tell people what we didn't know, tell people what we were doing about it. And that's when I started to really think about trustworthiness and the drivers of it and how you demonstrate it. Not tell people about it, but demonstrate it, do it. Because while the headlines were saying there's a breach of competence here, and people were worried about that, the way it was responded to was reinforcing that with actually there's no breach of values though. So this has happened, it happens. This is how we are going to tell you about it. We're going to tell you honestly what we don't know, and we're going to tell you what we're doing about it. And we're trading on, you know, 20 years of having done that. And what I started to see was those measures going up and up and up. And so that's why I did this piece of work, to really understand and unpick what was behind trustworthiness, because you shouldn't really just do the post-mortem when it goes wrong. You should do it when it goes right, so you get it right again next time. But the pressure to not do the right thing was substantial. And if it hadn't been for the particular legislative framework that set up our organisation, where I could go, no, look at the Food Standards Act, you don't get to do that, you know, which is career limiting, possibly. But if it hadn't been for that setup, we wouldn't have been able to do the right thing.
So the independence really mattered there.
Massively, yeah.
Which brings me to another question, and I'll start with Hilary, but I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. Does trust in tech and trust in regulators differ between the UK and the US, in your view?
I don't really know. I don't really know. I think I don't really know, because there's so much going on in politics that influences regulation, that influences trust, that I think they're so intertwined. And also we've got the, all the text coming from you guys. So
hey,
you
I'm
can blame
Australian.
you.
Don't blame me, I'm Australian.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we're talking, obviously, Wendell, looking at this is an international problem, and we've got national regulators, and we've got national self-interest, and we've got geopolitics, and all of this wades in to the delivery of efficient regulation. I think that we could be regulating earlier and better with a more collaborative approach. I think the biggest cause of distrust in regulation is the fact that people believe that money is being put before people. And lo and behold, the tech companies are putting money before people, and the regulators are not doing anything about it, and then wondering why trust is falling. So I think that's equal, actually, between both of our countries.
I think there's a philosophical difference, really, between the two in terms of how regulation is conceived of. So in Europe, you can't put on anything onto the market until it's been proven to be safe. Here, completely different legislative framework, totally different regulatory culture. You can put it on until someone proves in law that it's not. To some extent, I mean, that's a broad characterization, and lawyers will have a far better way of expressing it. But I think we've got that basic difference where I'm imagining on this side of the Atlantic, what we do looks extremely precautionary, possibly to a fault.
Okay, I'm going next. Okay. So my hypothesis has been that in the US, it's more of an innocent until proven guilty. And I'm sitting here in a law school with a lot of people who know a whole lot more about this than I do. But in other parts of the world, it's more guilty until proven innocent. So it's taking what Michelle was saying, but kind of exploring it a little bit more, and that's more a hypothesis. But I think there's some truth to it. And what's interesting to me is where self-regulation comes in is also in more of the innocent until proven guilty. And for me, one of the interesting examples is the approach to airworthiness. So in the UK and in Europe, EASA does a lot of the regulation of the aviation industry in whether a plane is safe or not safe. In the US, you have delegation of some responsibility from like the FAA to people that have been identified to act on behalf of the FAA and do airworthiness certifications. So I've personally witnessed 2 airworthiness certifications, and it is fascinating that they pick a person, they train them, and then they do the right thing in terms of making sure that this aircraft is safe and reliable and ready, to be used. So I think there really is a philosophical difference, and I think Michelle, did a good job of explaining it.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think it actually extends even to self-regulation because various countries around the world have self-regulatory organizations similar to mine, and in the UK it's the ASA, Standards Authority, and we meet and get together from time to time, and even there I see there's much more of a willingness and ability to take action and to kind of to assume guilt as opposed to innocence. And it's just maybe the culture of the US where we come from. It's much more suspicion about government action and suspicion about whether that's the right thing to do and more willingness to give leeway to the companies themselves. So it's been interesting for me to see that even on a self-regulatory basis, we are way more hands-off than the others.
So I just wanted to say one more thing. So what's interesting is the hybrid. If you can clear the hurdle in the EU, for example, and you can clear the hurdle in the US, then you're even more confident that, yes, these planes are airworthy. Okay, just as an example.
That's a really interesting framing, because the way you framed it is very much in terms of, I am not a lawyer, so forgive me, but that sounds like criminal law to me. Innocent till proven guilty, those are not the terms in which we often deal. We do prosecute, but I think it's more at the basis of it. You're probably right. There's a real difference in the appetite for and the envelope for government intervention in the first place on anything. And there's a slightly different balance, I guess, in kind of the interests of industry and innovation or the interests of public health, public welfare that you see seeded throughout society in different countries. And so I think there is something quite profound about that makes it different.
Fantastic. So I think this is a great point to actually open up questions to the floor. We did have this mic, but I got told by Gary that I'm not to throw it because apparently somebody was going to sue us when it bonked them on the head. So rather, I don't want to get sued today.
Only in America.
Exactly, only in America. So rather than kind of throw this out, the whole is of the size where if you just stand up and use a loud voice, we should be able to hear you. So when you do have a question, please indicate and I will point. But also please introduce yourself and say where you're from. So I knew Jay was going to be the first question. So Jay, we'll start with you.
Thank you. My name is Jay Carpenter. I'm the founder of the Digital Blockchain Artists Chain community in Arizona. And I have a question for Hilary. And you kind of touched upon this, that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, what grade would you give the regulatory regime overall in terms of effectiveness, number one, and what grade would you give the regulatory regime overall in terms of the public's trust of the regulatory regime on a scale of 1 to 10?
Random stuff. That is a great question. I have no idea. I would say it differs in different countries, and it differs in different countries with different relationships to government and regulation, different beliefs in the effectiveness of governance. I know from the UK that we had a government that was distrusted, so perhaps on a sort of 2, but we had an NHS and a regulatory system that was sort of on a 7. And that combination of trust and distrust in different institutions combined to give us probably a 6, if you sort of mean. It was not just that the regulators had done a good thing. We were quite early. We were quite, we actually were one of the earliest to approve it. But that was also done because, well, for various different reasons. But I think that the British people had trust in that process, partly because of their trust in other things like the NHS. And therefore, that was probably the thing that made that appear more trustworthy than people's knowledge of the nuts and bolts of the regulation. It's not a very good answer, actually, but I'm not know what everybody else has to say, because I don't.
Thank you. And I do have a confession. So, Jay Carpenter, my degree of trust is heightened by people, Di, Hilary, and Michelle, who speak with a British accent.
It's an Australian accent, thank you very much. Don't mix those ones up.
Okay. So I think what's really interesting about trust in science and scientists is that tends to be really high. And there is some remnant of deference and authority there. Sometimes the accent helps. But the other thing is that people got very interested very quickly and had access to an awful lot of information very quickly. And everyone became an armchair epidemiologist, didn't they? And all of a sudden people knew what R was, and they were able to compare on good information and bad, but compare efficacies of vaccines, and they talked about that one, and we don't want that one, that doesn't work as well as this one, and some of that information was real. And you had this moment where people were suddenly really interested because they'd had that blind faith shaken. They were hungry for information, they were learning about it, and that appetite for direct contact from science and scientists went up. And for the first time, I think, in history, it was able to happen. I mean, obviously there were lectures given in Victorian London around cholera and that sort of thing, but for the first time, really, you could have mass media and then direct contact through, social media with people who were doing the science. And certainly in the UK, and I know here they rely really, really heavily on the trustworthiness of the scientists. So, okay, they might not have trusted Boris Johnson, but we trusted Patrick Vallance, who was the chief scientist. And, there wasn't a single broadcast that didn't have him front and centre. So I think the question of kind of whether that's a moment that scientists can then capitalise on if they know how to communicate in a good way is yes. And we did a little bit of work a year or so ago now to look at where that appetite had gone and were people more open to having more educated, more deliberative conversations around this rather than just going, oh, that's too hard, I can't possibly understand. And scientists going, oh, that's too hard, they won't possibly understand. All of a sudden we had this moment where we had to explain to people, and at pace, and when we didn't know the answer. So some of that honest uncertainty, which is a kind of real principle of trustworthiness, if you don't know, don't pretend you do, is a risk that most people don't really want to take, but actually, as it was happening in real time, I think that built trust.
Does anybody else have anything that they would like to add?
I don't know, I'm not going to pretend I do. On that question, vaccines out of my scope.
So I'll say something. So I think it's miraculous that in such a short time, technology, the technology providers rose to the occasion and came up with the MR and vaccines, and that the regulators fast-tracked things and did whatever they could to put human well-being in front of everything. And so I think that there was an attempt at honesty. Here's what we know now, and to some extent what we don't know, but we're sure working on it. So I think in many ways it's a success story. The fact that we are now back in person without masks is really a triumph. So.
Beautifully put.
Richard Williams, formerly of FDA, now with the Center for Science. So I wonder, Michelle, particularly if you'd like to speak about the issue of when distrust can be a good thing. And I'll give you an example. FDA has enjoyed tremendous trust, probably right at the top for many years, and yet over about 5 decades, they have not improved food safety at all, despite the fact that their budget's been going up, they've been given more authority, but they're extremely well trusted. And I think without distrust, there's not enough incentive for change.
That's an interesting question. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm afraid I don't know the work of the FDA as well enough to be able to kind of tell a story around why that might be the case. It is true that, as we just talked about, having a burning platform makes people move faster. Having scrutiny makes people do better. So I wonder, though, if you're saying that all of this stuff has happened but trust remains high, whether that, how would you generate this mistrust that would then move change? Would that be worth it?
Well, I think so. I mean, I don't think a lot of people know the facts about food safety, for example.
Oh, no, they don't, yeah.
Really haven't made any improvements in 50 years. And so I think maybe some education of the public where they say, you know what, it's time that you start to look at what you're doing, what your procedures are, and you need to, because at the end, it's one thing to have a very trusted agency, and that's great for the agency, but if they're not making improvements in public health, in a sense, trust can be a bad thing.
So as you were talking, I was thinking of one example where distrust caused a huge improvement, actually here in the US, and that was the Tylenol scandal, where you had contaminated Tylenol. And the company was responsible and moved quickly to take things off the shelves. But then what happened is you had drug safety improved because that's where all these child lock lids came from. So that was distrust of the drug supply, and that led to innovations in packaging technology, and that we all benefit from today.
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not going to answer it specifically, but I was doing some talk somewhere, and everybody sort of has this thing, is we need more trust. And one of the speakers in I think it might have been cyber, was saying there's far too much trust, really far too much trust. We need much more scrutiny, too much trust. And then talking to other regulators that said, yeah, we think if they knew how useless we were, they wouldn't trust us at all. And so, in fact, maybe there just is far too much trust. And when the thing really, in my experience over these years, that switches is the voice and power of civil society to call it out. And what's happening in all of our countries is civil society is getting squashed and getting squashed down and getting underfunded. And I think in terms of a healthy society, a flourishing civil society with funding to do research, with a power and agency, actually perhaps gives it a better balance. And therefore, I always think, if I had, what would I say if there was one thing that I would do? I would actually have a flourishing civil society, a collaborative one with citizens, approaches where there is a genuine inclusion in the process of decision-making, whether it's in law or policy, where there's much less behind the scenes, there's much more upfront, perhaps much more argument and much more what Michelle's saying. But actually, it's really more of a participatory process.
So I've thought about what I wanted to say now. I think you're not talking about trust. I think you're talking about blind faith, and I think that that is dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're talking about belief against the evidence or lack of evidence, then you are talking about faith. If you're talking about trust, where things are open and debatable and looked at and challenged, and you can come out of that with a relatively resilient level of trust, you may deserve it. But I don't think that's what you're talking about in this case, by the sounds of it.
Okay, so I've got a queue of 5 questions and we've got 15 minutes, so these are going to have to be rapid fire. Lady up the back.
Hi, Leah Bishop, lawyer from Indiana University. I'm going to make a very humble first cut attempt to synthesize what I heard the panel said, at least correct me and fill in what I learned. So I'm hearing that we like regulation of technology, at least in theory. And if Helen's timeline is correct, and I trust it, elected officials have profoundly inadequate expertise
I think that's one for you, Hilary.
I have become very keen on process recently. So I didn't really know how important process was. And in terms of, I think there is certainly value in independence, but a trustworthy process of development, I think, is as good as you'll get to demonstrate and provide evidence of your trustworthiness. And I don't mean to bang on about these blooming trust drivers again, but, you know, I've got a talk I'm doing tomorrow about engagement in regulation, because it's the public interest good. Now, back to this idea, the fear is that you're putting money before people, openly demonstrating the public interest, designing a process which is open, which is inclusive of all perspectives. Now, that is really, really hard. You know, a little mini doc that I did on my trust report, which is and regulators are a trusted environment, actually. So building a trusted environment for a more collaborative approach to governance is really important, especially with new technologies, where it's not is it safe or isn't it? We've got ethical dilemmas that there is no right answer. And there is no way of doing that without having an open discussion about our priorities and our values and what we want and what we don't want. And then I think also one of the most important aspects of this, which is probably a whole other project, which is visible impact. You have to demonstrate that you've taken on board different perspectives, and you have to explain, as Michelle said, explain why the decisions you've chosen have been chosen, and why those perspectives that have not been adopted have been chosen not to be adopted. And one of the big things about trust is explanations, which seems really sort of like explanations, yeah, well, but no, explanations don't happen. Visible impact in terms of demonstrating why you've made this decision doesn't happen. The decision happens, we've decided, black box behind, the end. So that's where I'm going, which is a much more open and collaborative process is the anchor, I think.
Thank you. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, and then 4 in the queue.
I'm Cameron Bucker. I'm in philosophy at the University of Houston. So that answer actually segues perfectly with the question I asked. Was one of the quickest conceptual changes I've ever seen is 3-4 years ago, everybody in the space was talking about explainability. And now we're all talking about trust. And it's basically the same spots. And I wondered if that was a deliberate shift for anyone, if anybody wanted to talk about that shift as well.
I just think it's the new thing on the block, I was involved when we talked about responsibility, and it was corporate responsibility, and then it became responsible innovation, and then it became this. I think trust is the new kid on the block. But I also think we've started to see and have more, trust is one of the most researched things on the planet, believe it or not, in academia. And I think it just has become something that people talk about, and but it actually does then refer back to some really basic values. So I think it's interesting, but I think it's just new. That's why. I think that's probably a bit, I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, I think explainability is part of the trust equation, right? It hasn't gone away. It's just incorporated into that. And think about the NIST framework for responsible AI. Explainability is one of the principles that they included there. So, and maybe it is just trust is the the word of the day, and we'll have something, but it seems to me it's an important part, as well as what Hilary said to the earlier question about the process and having an open and transparent process. And in my view, that's really critical. And being the openness and transparency and public reporting, public decisions, public accountability is all part of it.
I think there's something about speed of technological innovation, and trust is no longer just about trust between humans. It's also trust between humans and machines. It's machine trust of other machines. I think the whole rate of acceleration is changing, and I think as of the 2020s, history will look back and say we have entered the autonomous age.
From an environmental and kind of green background, where the whole discussion
interest in being seen as trusted. So in the ESG world, for example, or in the certifications world, there's a lot of attention to who gets to certify and then how do you support the certifier in order to enable the sales of a whole bunch of other things. And it struck me that there's a mismatch between the emphasis on what can practitioners, agencies, and individuals do versus what does an ecosystem for discernment look like, and what are ways to build that ecosystem for discernment and when to over and under trust. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts or frameworks or anything you can point us to for interventions at the ecosystem level to build discernment around the right level of trust. A little bit different than, what can you do as an agent, but how do you shape the overall dynamics of trust?
I can try. All right, I'll give you an example. It's not from the environmental world, okay? But it's from automated driving. So there was a major milestone made a year ago, and the industry grappled with how safe is safe enough for autonomous vehicles. So last year, we were sitting here, and all of those Waymo vehicles going by had safety drivers in them. 1 year later, we are back, and there are no safety drivers in some of these vehicles. So that was the industry coming together and demonstrating some level of trustworthiness that now relax the requirement that you have a human behind the wheel that's been in effect actually since horse and buggy days. Okay, you had to have a driver on the reins of the horse. So it dates back to the early days of automotive and with the Vienna Convention and all that stuff. So that was the industry coming together. They helped develop an IEEE standard 2846 to answer the question, not as a company and not as just regulators, but as an industry, and you had participation from China and the EU and North Korea and Japan. They all came together to answer that question as an industry and as an ecosystem with the chip suppliers and the verification and validation people. And that was a really interesting example of the world coming together to deal with an industry-wide problem and get consensus in the ecosystem. And the reward for that is that now you have vehicles out there without humans behind the wheel.
Can I give it a go?
Sure, yes,
Really
please.
quickly. Really hard question. But I just wanted to, I'm thinking of it as an ecosystem for trustworthiness. Because I have a thing that trust is a bit like love and happiness. The more doggedly you pursue it, the more elusive it gets. We want you to trust. It's like, no, go away. So an ecosystem for trustworthiness. And I'm doing a little talk tomorrow about a concept I've been sort of thinking about, which is pro-society innovation and regulation, which is about an ecosystem for innovation and regulation that is pro-society. And I say pro-society deliberately because only in the UK, in the middle of the whole ChatGPT thing, we have our launch of our new digital strategy, which is a pro-innovation digital strategy, which actually anyone was thinking, now you're calling it a pro, we want innovation, we want and actually it just struck me that we don't want a pro-innovation strategy, we want a pro-society innovation strategy, where innovation is really focused on public good, not just technological, innovation for its own sake. And so one of the things I was looking at with this pro-society concept is there are interventions at all sorts of different points. From, GDP and neoliberal capitalism, that's a prevention of an ecosystem for trustworthiness because it's so narrow. The way systems in terms of academic research and focus on papers, that doesn't help a pro-society approach. Funding, whether it's academic funding, whether it's accountability of shareholders, there is no mechanism for the accountability of shareholders, just none. And so all of these things are sort of spanners in the works of an ecosystem for trustworthiness. And so that's what I'm trying to think about. I'd love to talk to you about it. Because one person's trustworthiness is another person's, lack of precaution or too much precaution. So it is back to this balance of values and being pro-public interest, pro-society, perhaps even pro-equity, which means that the least fortunate are raised, and the more fortunate have to sort of stick around there where they are. So it's very, very hard thing to do, but I think it's about levers and changing levers and processes at critical points.
I think the question boils down to how do you... An ecosystem of discernment is a really nice way of putting it. You're asking for people's attention to something. You're asking people to flip out of that automatic mode and into a very kind of labour-intensive mode. And in order to do that, they have to care and they have to think that it genuinely matters and put in that effort. And I don't know the answer, but I would hypothesize that if you had to rank all the things that mattered, it doesn't come top yet.
No.
So the question is really, how do you make it matter to every point in that ecosystem? Yeah. And this is why crisis is an interesting point, because suddenly it matters. And actually we've seen that when it does matter, it comes out all right some of the time, but there has to be that burning platform to make people divert their attention to that thing as opposed to profit.
We're just nearly at time, but we do have 2 more questions that I think we can squeeze in, so I'll hand over.
Thank you. I'm Hilary from the University of Wisconsin and Morgan Institute of Research. And so I was really my mind kind of got stuck for a moment when we were talking about how difficult it is for regulators or for Congress to pass law regulating information technology and AI and generative AI and things like that. And so I was thinking about privacy law and how digital data is in the United States, and the example of HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, where Congress failed to regulate the privacy of medical records. But what they did was sort of turf it to the agencies, to HHS, to write regulations. So obviously, as a matter of statute, Congress did not make privacy statute in the U.S., but they did turf it to HHS, which made privacy regulations, which, we're all living with, and people have complaints about them, but they're probably better than not having those privacy regulations. So I was wondering whether something similar, for a variety of reasons, could happen in the space around, say, generative AI, right? That it is true that many members of Congress and even their staff have very little expertise in this area, but also true, I think, as a matter of comparative institutional analysis, that the same social forces that make it hard for Congress to write any law might also make it difficult for industry voluntary standards to have any teeth or to really represent the values that many people in society have. But would it be possible to basically turf this to some agency which might be less susceptible to those same social forces, or more able to take account of the public interest? And if so, what agency might be a good one to do some of this?
Yeah, I think definitely the Congress could pass a law and direct, say, the Federal Trade Commission, maybe in consultation with some other agencies, to come up with regulations on AI. There would still be the issue of how much direction they gave them and how much granularity, and that would raise the difficulty of getting a majority to agree on a path forward, which has prevented comprehensive privacy legislation could still exist in something like that. But it is possible, and some people have called for a new digital tech regulator, like a new agency altogether that would bring together experts from various agencies, and that they would be well situated to do that. So I think that is a possibility. Again, it's a matter of the ability to really see a path forward and make it happen. And I do think that, of course, I mentioned I think there could be a role for independent self-regulation here. Not to say there aren't hurdles. And frankly, the threat of regulation would be the best way of getting, a self-regulatory program off the ground, because that usually is often is what will instigate self-regulation. So I think that with the benefit of some, input folks who are really well-versed in these issues already, crafting proposed regulation, for example, some sort of, proposal that they could give to Congress that would have enough meat on the bones that would allow them to vote on it and understand what they were voting on could be a way forward there.
I don't know your area and your country at all, but one of the things which is happening with us, which I think is quite interesting, we're having, I don't know what it's called, like a something digital forum, where I think there's 5 or 6 regulators that could be regulating in the digital space, and they all are needed. And, one super regulator isn't going to do it because they all, have got a role to play. But we have this forum where they are discussing the regulations and amongst themselves and evaluating it there. And I think that's quite an interesting move.
We will now move to our final question.
Yes, thank you so much, Dean Bowman, and thank you so much to the panel for your expertise and the substantive remarks. I have many notes. I'll be brief. So my name is Emil Wilson-Lucibus. I'm a law professor at the University of Hawaii, and I've had the privilege of working with Hilary and also with Helen on the organizational governance of AI. I also clerked for Commissioner Anthony at the FTC and was in the Bureau of Consumer Protection, so I'm really all there. Okay, so my question has to do about, from the organizational perspective, I really appreciate the soft law approach. I'm looking forward to learning more about GBB's national programs, but it seems to me that in trust, being exposed, being subject to the rule of law, the rule of public law, would go further in terms of making organizations be trusted, especially now with AI and ChatGPT and commentary on the Hill. So I wondered how this aspect of, being forced to prove in a court of law, for example, that you are adhering to the standards, for example, under the national programs. You've got a private group agreeing to conform with these standards as I understand them. But then you mentioned something that's really interesting, Mary, about the bringing in the FTC if there's one. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much.
And so we do have the legal backstop of the regulator for most all of our programs. If the company doesn't participate or comply, then they can be referred to the government, and the FTC looks at it as a potential violation of the FTC Act. And so that, and that has been a really important incentive for compliance with the programs. Sometimes the mere threat of being referred is sufficient to bring the company back into the fold, and we don't have to actually do the referral. In fact, that's the case most of the time. But I mean, I totally agree that, it's self-regulation isn't the solution for everything. I love Helen's, the schema on the airplanes. I mean, I wouldn't want to rely on self-regulation for that, honestly. So, it's important to have binding rules and regulations, but there are a lot of areas where it's not necessarily essential, or certainly self-regulation can be a complement or an adjunct to. And in fact, the questioner over there talked about HIPAA and regulation of health privacy, and right now we have tons of health information that's not covered by HIPAA, right? Everything that's collected by your apps, by your wearables, your health websites. FTC's brought some law enforcement actions, but that's not covered by HIPAA. That's vastly unregulated, right? And that would be, an example of something where self-regulation could really address it. They could take those principles and put them in place more quickly than Congress can seem to get, or the FTC can pass regulations.
So that is the perfect note to finish on. It is very clear that trust is very difficult to talk about, let alone to break down and really understand it. But I think the four of you have done such a wonderful job in terms of giving frameworks, terminology, and just a lot to think about as we go through the next day and a half. So thank you very much for your expertise and your time and willingness to be here and to discuss the work that you've been engaging in. Thank you to the audience for your active participation. And again, thank you to Gary. As Gary mentioned earlier, coffee is up the back, and we start back in the next session at 10:45. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. We want our